Lapse. Joining us now, Peter Wallison, former General Counsel to the US Treasury Department and former White House counsel to President Ronald Reagan. Peter Wallison is also author of the new book, Hidden in Plain Sight: What Really Caused the World's Worst Financial Crisis and Why It Could Happen Again. Peter Wallison, thanks for joining us from Newsmax, Washington. Man, that title gets our attention. I know you've written a book about it, but Peter, give us the lowdown. Why could we be headed for trouble again?
Well, thanks, first of all, for inviting me to talk about the book. The book really makes the point that it was the government's housing policies that caused the financial crisis. Although the crisis has been blamed by the government and by the media mostly on the private sector and on Wall Street, it was the government's housing policies between 1992 and 2008 which destroyed, really, the underwriting, the mortgage underwriting system in this country. And so by 2008, more than half of all mortgages in the United States were subprime mortgages. And when they began to default, which began in 2007 and 2008, they brought down the financial system. Now, those mortgages, and this is the important point, 76% of those subprime mortgages were on the books of government agencies, which means that it was the government that had created the demand for those mortgages.
But you said only 24% were on the books of the private sector, correct?
Right, that's exactly right. Only 24% were on the books of the private sector. So if you think about what really caused the financial crisis, most of it was done by the government because it wanted those low-quality mortgages. And the reason the book talks about the fact that we can have another financial crisis is that the government is doing it again. The president has recently proposed to reduce FHA fees. A couple of weeks ago, the regulator of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two major government-backed mortgage companies, told them to accept lower quality mortgages than they had been accepting up to now. And all of that goes to show that the government is starting to do exactly what it did in causing the financial crisis by reducing underwriting standards.
So we've got about 3.5 minutes left in this segment, Peter, and I'm really curious. Government is repeating the same mistakes. How much of this comes through legislation? How much of this is really the guidance of President Obama and his officials at Treasury and his economic advisors?
Right now, this is all the administration. Congress has not done anything that would encourage this kind of activity, except they adopted the DoddFrank Act in 2010, and that was blamed on the private sector. So they didn't prohibit the kinds of things that the government is now doing.
Peter,
so this is yes, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, you continue.
I was just going to say that this is the sort of thing we can expect from the government, because by reducing underwriting standards, they make a lot of people who could otherwise perhaps not afford homes because they have bad credit, makes a lot of people happy. But in the end, it makes everyone else unhappy because we have a lot of mortgage defaults, a lot of evictions, and a collapse like we had in 2008.
The Obama administration claims that the economy has actually improved since President Obama has been in office, and that his administration is credited for saving the financial system from basically a collapse. What would be your response to that?
Well, first of all, of course, the economy couldn't get any worse than it was when he came into office, so the economy has improved. The trouble is, this was the slowest recovery from a recession that we have had since the 1960s, and the reason for that is the DoddFrank Act. We spent our time after the financial crisis blaming the private sector for what happened in the financial crisis instead of focusing on increasing employment and increasing economic growth. As long as we blame the private sector and impose new regulations on them, which we did with the DoddFrank Act, we are going to have a very slow recovery, and that's why the administration has been unsuccessful in at least leading a stronger recovery since the 2008 recession.
So as you see it, Peter, the Dodd-Frank legislation was really a solution in search of a problem. Let's just say, for
Exactly.
should Congress...
It was the wrong solution to the wrong problem.
Fair enough. Mindful of that. Should Congress draft new legislation? If they would, in the minute and a half that remains, what should that legislation include?
Well, the first thing Congress should do is go back to the DoddFrank Act and reform it substantially. It has placed so many restrictions on the private sector and created so much uncertainty that lending is still very difficult and economic growth is still much slower than it should be. So Congress should go back and come back in, roll back a lot of the Dodd-Frank restrictions, and then turn to the housing market, where they should take the government out of the business of financing housing.
So you're saying
it's been the government's role in the housing business that has created all of the volatility that we have had in the housing market over the last 50 years.
So Freddie and Fannie should be finished, gone, in other words. I beg your pardon, 30 seconds remains, Peter.
Yes, Fannie and Freddie should be eliminated. We can't do it immediately because they are central, they are still central to our housing markets because the government made them central to the housing markets. But over time, over the next 5 to 10 years, they can be eliminated if we allow the private sector to come in and start making mortgages in the right way. So we always have sound mortgages in our financial system, as we did before 1992, when the legislation was adopted that caused Fannie and Freddie to make very poor quality loans.
The name of the book, Hidden in Plain Sight: What Really Caused the World's Worst Financial Crisis and Why It Could Happen Again. Peter Wallison, we thank you for your time. Hey, we'd also invite you to take a look at today's poll question. Do you believe President Obama is handling the threat of Islamic terrorism properly? We want to hear from you. Go to newsmax.com/poll.